American divers never found the priceless war treasures lost beneath the ocean depths. American divers never found the priceless war treasures lost beneath the ocean depths. The promise of this story is simple and terrifying. Tons of wartime wealth vanished under black water, and every American expedition sent to recover it came back with little more than silence. It begins in the final months of World War II, when the Pacific night was thick with rain and radio static. Somewhere off the coast of China, a ship moved alone through the dark. A name glowed faint on her stern. Awa Maru. The world knew her as a protected relief vessel, but whispered into mess halls and map rooms was another description. A floating vault. Crates sealed tight. Silk-wrapped packets. Heavy wooden boxes packed with something that doesn't rattle when you shake it. Here's your first hard fact. One you can look up the moment this ends. On April 1, 1945, the American submarine USS Queenfish torpedoed the Awa Maru, killing more than 2,000 souls. Only one man survived, and the treasure, if it existed, never came home. The sea swallowed the truth in a single night. What exactly went down with that ship? Why did American divers, with maps, money, and military pressure, never bring those riches back to daylight? The answer waits below, and the clock is already running. The night the ocean turned to glass, they said the sea was calm that night. A deceptive calm, the kind that tricks your breath into slowing. The moon hid behind cloud cover. The rain was thin needles. Up on the bridge of the USS Queenfish, young men watched green ghosts drift across a radar screen and tried to decide who lived and who died. War doesn't pause for perfect certainty. It never has. The order came in a voice that carried the weight of habit. Torpedoes readied. Depth calculated. Bearing fixed. Out there, somewhere beyond the smeared edge of glass, moved a ship with the right shape, the right speed. Not a relief vessel. Not tonight. That was the belief in those minutes. That was the verdict that steered men toward a decision that cannot be undone. The torpedoes left in a silver hiss and vanished into a dark that looked empty. The crew held their breath. Then the sea heaved upward as if punched from below. The AWA Maru broke, staggered, and rolled. Steam screamed. Lights died. Radios spat. Staterooms turned sideways. Somewhere inside that tumbling world, someone clutched a crate because it was heavy and steady, and felt like an anchor in a room that had just forgotten what down meant. The ship exhaled a last breath of air. A huge oval bubble that blossomed on the surface, and then flattened as the Awa Maru slipped away. Silence returned. Not peace. Never peace. Just a sudden bare silence that felt like a door slamming in the middle of the night. They found one survivor. One. A man lifted from a vast black plane, and wrapped in a blanket that could not stop the shaking. He said nothing about crates. Nothing about sealed rooms. He spoke of screams that came in layers, of corridors that turned into wells, of hands on his ankles in the dark. He watched the faces around him measure his words as if they were numbers in a ledger. It didn't take long for the truth to catch up with the Queenfish. The Awa Maru had been guaranteed safe passage by the Allies. A protected relief ship. It was supposed to be a ghost that no one would shoot at. But the fog of war is not fog. It's smoke. It blinds. The United States would apologize. The Navy would court-martial. The records would be stamped, signed, filed. The story should have ended with shame and ceremony. It did not end. Somewhere in that first stunned week, a rumor crossed a radio room. It arrived without a return address and left before the message could be logged. The AWA Maru, it said, wasn't empty. She was loaded. War valuables. Contraband. Names on lists of things that were supposed to be returned after the fighting, but somehow became lost in transit. Ivory combs. Jade discs. Platinum ingots wrapped in oilskin. And something heavier than dreams. Sailors talk. Officers don't, but even officers are men who share mess tables and stare at the same grey walls. Stories slipped down ladders and spread from ship to ship. American divers would be sent, people said, when the smoke cleared and the storms settled, not to find bodies. To find boxes. The first search was clumsy, quick, more gesture than mission. War still raged. The sea doesn't wait, but governments do. Charts were vague. Coordinates were argued. The exact point of impact swam back and forth across pencil lines like a fish that refuses to take the hook. The divers went down anyway. Navy-issue gear, ropes that hummed with current, knives that flashed when the sun angled right. They returned with pieces of hull and the stunned look of men who met a grave and felt the wrongness of taking anything from it. And yet, something had been taken already. That was the whisper. Not by Americans. By the sea. By time. By someone else who got there first. A foreign trawler scene where no trawler should be. A depth charge in the night that boomed like thunder for no declared reason. When the sun rose, bubbles. Only bubbles. The official line hardened. The AWA Maru carried relief supplies. The sinking was a mistake. The United States would pay damages. The case, as far as a courtroom was concerned, was closed. But a closed case is not a closed story. Men who steer ships know the feel of a loaded hull, the way a vessel sits lower, the way her wake thickens. Reports from Allied radar posts hinted at a weight that didn't match her declared cargo. One officer wrote a single word in his margin next to her name. Heavy gears turned. Victors went home and learned how to sleep without flinching when doors slammed. In Tokyo, survivors rebuilt routines out of rubble. In Washington, medals gleamed in boxes at the backs of drawers. And still, sometimes, at bars near naval bases, someone would lean in and say the two words that pulled silence into a tighter circle. AWA Maru, when maps were declassified and apologies carved their last initials into the page. The AWA Maru returned to the surface as a mission. Not the ship herself. The idea of her. The promise that treasure waits for those who dive deep enough, risk hard enough, and refuse to blink. Americans love that kind of mission. It sounds like redemption, like the ocean offering a second chance. But the ocean is not in the forgiveness business. The first serious American-led surveys after the war were more precise. Better charts, new sonar, a discipline learned from years of chasing submarines through dark water. They traced the seabed with fan-shaped sweeps and watched grey shapes bloom on paper. A wreck here. Another there. Not every wreck is the right wreck. Not every right wreck lets you in. Divers briefed. Divers slipped into water that felt colder than the numbers promised. Light thinned to milk, then to pewter, then to a night that pushed against masks and regulators as if darkness had weight too. Down there, time grows heavy. Every minute stretches. Every breath becomes a bar of music you count without melody. The bottom rose. The sand lay smooth and treacherous. And then? Metal. The AWA Maru's bones looked twisted by a giant hand. Plates peeled. Ribs gaped. The ship's insides, once private, were now a map of collapsed corridors and rooms packed in with silt-like lungfuls of dust. The divers looked, felt, probed. Their lights crawled over a doorway warped into a crescent. Inside, nothing stood that could be named. Another compartment. Another spill of debris. A teacup survived. A spoon. A watch whose hands pointed at the wrong hour forever. They wanted boxes. They found bedrooms. Night after night, the teams came back with stories told in short sentences and long silences. A name on a bulkhead. A shoe half swallowed by sand, fragile silk that dissolved when touched. The sea preserves what it wants. It erases the rest. If gold had been there, it was either gone or somewhere else in the wreck. Behind a wall, no longer a wall, under a floor that had become a slope of shifting grains. The divers were not grave robbers. They were professionals. They were also men tasked to answer a question that had grown louder in the years since the apology. What, exactly, had the AWA Maru carried? Here is the first payoff. The detail officials hid behind formality, but could not undo. The United States Navy admitted the sinking was a mistake, a violation of safe conduct, and paid compensation measured in millions to Japan. That kind of money is not paid lightly. It leaves shadows. It breeds theories. If the ship had carried only sacks of rice and packets of medicine, why did the rumors persist with the stubbornness of truth? This is where I ask something of you. not as a listener, but as a hunter drawn to the same dark horizon. If you want to chase this mystery with me all the way into the abyss, stay with this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next dive, and share it with the one friend who always wants to know what lies under the surface. We are only just breaking the THERMOCLINE. Back to the wreck. The Americans were not the only ones interested. Ocean floors are international in the worst way. Anyone with a ship, a hook, and a reason can become a stakeholder. Over the decades that followed, Chinese salvage teams would lower grabs and come up with twisted steel and the occasional ghost of a room. Later, scrap dealers sang their own unsentimental songs. Metal is money. History is weight. But in all that clanging and cutting, the story you're listening for never appears. No crates of bullion presented for the cameras. No sealed compartments pried open to reveal stamped bars stacked like cakes on a holiday table. Just silence. Just denials. Just the long hiss of acetylene and the clatter of rust. So what if the Awa Maru was a decoy? What if the real vault traveled another route entirely, on another night, under a different sky? The Pacific in 1945 was a tangled net of desperate routes and secret arrangements. Japanese officials understood the war was falling through their hands like sand. They shipped valuables home, out, sideways, anywhere but into the pockets of whoever stepped ashore when the flags changed. Some of those ships made it, some of those ships did not. This is where the American divers began to widen their charts. Not just one wreck. A pattern. A language in the coordinates. They sifted through captured cables and captured rumors. A message intercepted on a Tuesday that mentioned cargo requiring silence. A manifest with columns of vague nouns. The AWA Maru began to look like the headline in a newspaper with 5 other stories on the page. The search grew a second name. I-52. Of all the vanished, the Japanese submarine I-52 is the one that feels least like a ship and most like a rumor with a pressure hull. Her mission was a thread in a web the public rarely hears about. Trade between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. A last gasp exchange of technology, materials, and money. The I-52 moved west across Blackwater with plans to meet a German U-boat. Metal for secrets. Secrets for metal. On board, men. Codenames, red routes, and blacklists. The ocean remembers what men try to forget. It keeps ledgers that don't rot, debts that don't fade. And when one mystery sinks, another begins to rise from the same dark water. The year was 1945. The war in the Pacific was ending. But not quietly. Japan's empire was collapsing piece by piece, and with every retreat came an order whispered through secure lines: move the assets. The gold, the art, the stones. Anything that might rebuild a nation or buy for commerce when the flags changed. But where do you hide a fortune when every port burns? You send it where no one can follow. Under the sea, American intelligence began hearing strange phrases in intercepted messages. Red routes, blacklists, Operation Dragon Current. They sounded like logistics reports, but the tonality was off. No troop movements, no weapon counts. Instead, coordinates that led not to battlefields but to deep-sea trenches, to islands that had no names on Allied maps. It was as if Japan had built a secret second war beneath the visible Yuan War to hide what could never be surrendered. And in the middle of it all, the name AWA Maru began to surface again. Allied cryptanalysts found references to a ghost vessel of mercy carrying cargo essential to national reconstruction. The language was diplomatic, but the coded documents suggested that her manifest included not only relief supplies but rare metals, museum artifacts, and sealed diplomatic trunks, the kind that only opened under imperial authority. When American command realized what they might have destroyed that April night, panic folded into secrecy. They classified nearly every log from the USS Queenfish. Divers were told to forget what they hadn't yet found. But curiosity doesn't obey orders, especially not among those trained to follow shadows. By 1947, the United States Navy had mapped nearly 100 suspected wreck sites across the Western Pacific. Some belonged to troop carriers. some to cargo ships whose names had been erased in surrender. But one cluster stood out, a series of ships lost within the same narrow corridor between Taiwan and the South China Sea. It was labeled on internal charts as Sector Black. No official mission name. No recovery reports. Just a circle drawn in grease pencil, and beside it, one word: priority. A rumor grew in that circle's wake that these were not accidents at all, that Japan had sent convoys east in the final days, filled with treasure looted from across Asia, gold from Singapore, diamonds from Burma, sacred relics from Beijing's temples. The empire had been dying, but it still thought in centuries, better to hide it all than let the victors claim it. And yet, every American dive into Sector Black came up empty. Sonar showed shapes that disappeared when they drew closer, metallic readings that bled into sand, whole wrecks that seemed to move between surveys. It made no sense, until one stormy afternoon, a team from Guam's naval intelligence found something, an old chart inside a confiscated Japanese trawler. On its yellowed surface, hand-drawn lines traced in red ink cut across the Pacific like veins. Each was marked with cryptic dates, symbols, and a single repeating phrase: Dragon Pathway. At first, no one could decode it. But an interpreter noticed something chilling: the dates didn't match wartime supply runs. They matched known Every red line ended where a ship had disappeared. A pattern, deliberate and precise. Someone had planned these losses. They weren't coincidences. They were cover stories. That discovery changed everything. The Americans began to suspect that the AWA Maru wasn't just an accident, it was part of an organized evacuation of wealth. Disguised as wartime chaos, but where did it all lead? Some believed to Taiwan, others whispered of the Philippines, but a few believed in something deeper, a storage ground below the ocean itself. In 1951, a classified mission known internally as Operation Lantern was launched. Its official purpose: survey sunken wartime cargo for post-war navigation safety. Its true intent: locate the rumored treasure convoys. Civilian records mention nothing about Lantern, but diary entries from participating divers later revealed glimpses of what they saw. One described descending on a wreck that wasn't in any registry, its markings burned off, its hull freshly torn, as if it had been sunk long after the war. Inside, crates filled the hold, marked only with kanji for rice. Yet when one cracked open under pressure, something gleamed. The diver's log ended mid. That entry was later censored. Weeks later, the same team reported the wreck gone, vanished without trace. Their coordinates now showed only an empty seafloor, as if the ocean itself had erased the evidence. Still, the search expanded. Cold War urgency demanded it. The US feared that whatever Japan had hidden might now belong to someone else: the Soviets, the Chinese, even old imperial loyalists building quiet empires in exile. By 1955, divers began finding strange markers on the seabed. Iron stakes hammered into coral, carved with coded numbers and symbols resembling naval identifiers. These weren't random wreckage. They were signposts, guides for those who knew the map. And yet, no matter how deep they went, no one found the vault. Instead, the wreck spoke back in fragments: bronze statues fused to decks, half-melted coins trapped in coral, steel bulkheads with bullet holes that didn't match any battle record. Whatever had been hidden down there, someone else had been hunting for it too. Then came the twist that froze the entire PERATION. A submersible, launched from the USS Petrel, recorded something impossibly: an enormous metallic shape, half buried under sand, miles from any recorded wreck. It was too large to be a ship, too round to be a natural formation. As the cameras drew closer, engraved Japanese characters appeared across the rim: Canoe Maru, a ship that never existed in any naval archive. Its hull was welded shut. No entry points. No hatches. A perfect tomb. When they tried to lift it, the cables snapped. Pressure readings spiked unnaturally, as if something inside resisted. The sub's instruments malfunctioned, cameras blacked out, and the Petrel's captain ordered an emergency ascent. They left it there, marked the coordinates, and sealed the report under restricted resources. That was the last official dive under the American flag in that region for nearly 20 years, but the sea doesn't forget. By the 1970s, private salvors began picking up the trail again. Among them was a man named William Red Carson, a Navy veteran turned deep-sea explorer. Carson believed the AWA Maru and the so-called Dragon Pathway were part of a larger designer secret imperial fund meant to rebuild Japan from the ashes. He called it the Deep Treasury. His theory was that the treasure wasn't meant to be retrieved by accident, but by instruction. Generations later, when the world had forgotten where to look, Carson dove 3 times over the same coordinates near the South China Sea Trench. Each time, sonar showed a perfect rectangular echo. Each time he returned, it was gone. Once, his ROV caught a flicker of polished metal and a flash of red paint under the silt. Before the feed cut, the last transmission his ship received was Carson's voice, distorted but clear enough to chill every listener. It's hollow. And it's not alone. The ROV never came back. Neither did Carson. After that, the mapmakers stopped marking the spot. The coordinates vanished from naval records again. Every document mentioning the Dragon Pathway was reclassified. The US claimed it had ended all interest in wartime treasure recovery. But the divers who'd been there knew better. The sea had answered once and been silenced. And yet, every so often, fishermen report strange currents in that same patch of ocean. Instruments fail. Compasses spin. Some nights, they swear they see faint lights moving under the surface. Like lanterns, drifting through fog. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear the creak of metal shifting far below, as if something waits patient, immense, alive in its stillness. The Americans called it a myth. The locals call it by another name, the sleeping vault. And somewhere, deep in that black silence, the Awa Maru's ghost is still waiting to tell the rest of her story. Flags over deep water. The sea has no borders, but men bring their flags wherever they go. And by the 1960s, the quiet hunt for the Awa Maru's lost treasure had become a new kind of war, one fought not with torpedoes, but with secrets. It began with a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken through thick glass by an American submersible named Sea Ghost. The image showed what looked like the corner of a hull, half buried in sand, with Japanese characters scrawled in corrosion, AWA. It could have been coincidence, or confirmation. Washington wanted to believe it was proof. Tokyo called it desecration. And the newspapers, they called it gold. Suddenly, the Awa Maru wasn't a ghost story anymore, it was a prize. American engineers were flown to Guam. New equipment arrived: steel diving bells, underwater cameras the size of refrigerators, cables thicker than a man's arm. The operation was classified under the name Project Neptune. Officially, it was about maritime archaeology. Unofficially, it was about redemption. Recovering the wreck meant recovering face after the wartime blunder. Finding treasure, that would be history rewritten. But the sea had other ideas. The first descent was almost gentle. The water was clear, the currents mild. The divers spoke in clipped radio bursts, their voices calm. Then, halfway down, the temperature dropped like a stone. Instruments blinked. Pressure spiked. The cums hissed and cut. When they resurfaced, one diver's helmet glass was cracked not from impact, but from inside. He refused to speak for 2 days. When he finally did, his words made even the hardest men pause. "I heard knocking," he whispered. From below, they sent another team. Then another. Each came back with stories that sounded like hallucinations, metallic sounds echoing through the deep. Lights seen flickering through the silt, sonar readings that showed structures where there should be none. But they kept diving. Curiosity, once ignited, doesn't drown easily. Then, on the 12th dive, they found something: an opening, a jagged wound in the seabed that led down into a blackness deeper than their instruments could measure. It wasn't a natural trench. It looked carved. As the submersible lowered a light, a reflection flashed back. Smooth, polished steel, writing in faded red paint. It wasn't the Awa Maru, it was something else, something larger. What followed never appeared in official records. The captain's log for that day ends abruptly with one line: descending into anomaly. The next entry appears 2 days later: mission suspended, awaiting orders, but sailors talk and whispers always find the surface. They said the sub returned empty. No crew, no signal. Just a hull scarred by heat, as if it had brushed against something alive. That incident split the operation. Half the team wanted to keep searching. The other half wanted to leave the wreck to its grave. But Washington had already spent millions, and pride costs more than money. The dives continued. The Japanese government protested. The Soviets sent ships to observe. Suddenly, the Pacific wasn't just water, it was tension. And then, amid the chaos, came the man who changed everything, Commander James Hollister, a diver with lungs like iron and a reputation for chasing impossible missions. He'd found lost submarines before. He'd brought up wreckage from 3 miles down. When he stepped aboard the recovery vessel, Orpheus, even the skeptics felt the air shift. Hollister wasn't there for rumors. He wanted proof. For weeks, they scoured the coordinates. Hollister dove deeper than anyone else dared. He studied sonar patterns, traced magnetic fields, followed every glint that broke through the dark. Nothing. Until one night, when the sea itself seemed to call him. A storm was moving in. The waves slapped the hull with steady fury. Hollister insisted on one last descent before the weather turned. His crew protested it was too dangerous, but he smiled, the way men do, when fear is part of the thrill. If there's something down there, he said, it's not waiting for calm seas. The cameras followed him as he dropped. 500 feet. 1,000. 1,500. The water grew black and cold, the light from above thinning until only the glow of his lamp marked his existence. And then, the seabed. There it was. The wreck's bow, massive and broken, angled into the mud like a dagger. Hollister ran his gloved hand along the corroded steel. He whispered the name through the static, AWA Maru. The ship looked wounded but proud. Plates peeled like old bark. Portholes blinked with trapped reflections. A strange stillness hung over it like a cathedral underwater. Hollister moved closer to the midsection, where sonar hinted at sealed compartments. That was where the rumors said the treasure was kept. He reached a doorway half collapsed under sill. His light cut through the gloom and froze. Inside was a corridor lined with something unexpected. Wooden crates, intact. Dozens of them, stacked like coffins. He tried to read the markings, but the silt refused to settle. He reached for one crate, brushing away sediment. The wood felt strangely soft, almost warm. He pressed harder and it crumbled. Inside was nothing. Empty space, and then, a sound. At first, faint. Then, unmistakable. A deep, resonant clang, like a ship's bell struck far away. Once, twice, then silence. Hollister turned, scanning the His oxygen monitor flickered. The comms hissed static. He spoke no reply. Back on the surface, his team watched the feed freeze. One frame lingered on screen, Hollister turning his head toward a faint light blooming behind him. The camera shook, caught a blur of movement, something large, mechanical, shifting in the dark. Then, the line went dead. When they hauled his cable back up, the hook came empty. The storm that followed was brutal. The Orpheus limped back to base with half her systems fried. The official report listed Hollister as lost to equipment failure. But off-record, divers swore they heard a voice on the sonar that night: 3 soft taps. Then 2, then 1. Morse code for a single word. Wait, after Hollister, Project Neptune was shut down. The Americans withdrew. The Soviets claimed they'd found fragments of the AWA Maru near their patrol routes, though no proof was shown. And Japan quietly sent its own team in 1972. Led by a private company fronting for the Ministry of Transport, they found the wreck again. They even brought up a few artifacts: bell, a compass, a captain's log half decayed by salt. But the pages that survived contained a final entry written in ink that had run to a blur. Only one word could be read clearly. Protect. Protect what? From whom? That question never left the divers who came after. By the 1980s. The wreck had become a myth wrapped in modern technology. Satellite scans, magnetometers, deep-sea drones, none could explain the shifting signals. Each time someone found the AWA Maru, she seemed to slip a little further away, as if moving deeper into time itself. And somewhere between those fading coordinates and the maps that no longer matched reality, the theory began to change. Maybe the treasure wasn't gold. Maybe it wasn't treasure at all, because in one of the recovered fragments from Hollister's diver scratched piece of metal found wedged in the submersible's hull, scientists discovered something strange. A coating of alloy that didn't match any wartime material. Microscopic analysis revealed elements that shouldn't have existed in 1945 manufacturing, and stamped faintly across its surface were letters in both Japanese and English. Property of Joint Command. Joint Command, a term that didn't exist until years after the war. The meaning was clear and terrifying. Whatever lay inside the AWA Maru's hold might not have been from the past at all. Since then, dozens of expeditions, American, Japanese, Russian, even private salvors have returned to the site. None have come back with what they were looking for, but every one of them reports the same thing. Instruments fail near the wreck. Lights dim, pressure readings flicker, and sometimes they hear the knocking. 3 taps, pause, 2 pause, 1 a call or a warning. And tonight, under that same black water, the AWA Maru still waits. Her hull breathes with the slow rhythm of the tide. Her secrets sealed behind steel and time. The divers who dare return say she's not sleeping anymore. They say she's listening. Echoes in the silt. The ocean was calm again, almost too calm. You could mistake it for peace if you didn't know what waited below. The coordinates of the AWA Maru had become more myth than math by now. Lines of longitude whispered in different tones by different men. Every expedition found something, but no two ships ever found the same thing twice. By the early 1990s, technology had caught up with obsession. Satellite positioning, sonar mapping, remote submersibles that could descend miles below the surface without risking a human life. America returned to the hunt, quietly, through private contractors. They called it an archaeological interest. But the funding came from old military budgets, hidden under marine research grants and foreign aid clauses. The past still owed someone money. On a grey morning in the South China Sea, a research vessel named Endeavour anchored over the coordinates believed to mark the AWA Maru's grave. The crew worked in near silence, their movements practiced, their faces pale under fluorescent light. Among them was Dr. Maren Holt, a marine historian with eyes like wet steel. She wasn't chasing gold, she wanted the truth, and she believed it was buried under the layers of silt that time had built like a shield. When the ROV descended, the monitors flickered with static, then slowly cleared into images of the seabed, a desolate world of shadows and movement. Coral draped over twisted metal, fish darted through the ribs of a ship that no longer had a name. Holt leaned closer to the screen. The shape of the wreck was unmistakable. She whispered the words like a confession. She's here. Hours passed as the submersible mapped the hull. Cameras glided through broken corridors and doorways bent by pressure. Then, one room came into view that made Holt's pulse quicken. A storage hold, sealed by what looked like reinforced steel plating. Not standard for a relief vessel, not for medicine or rice. Something valuable had been meant to stay inside. Cut it open, she ordered. The ROV's manipulator arms moved carefully, slicing through the corrosion. A hiss of trapped air escaped, rising in silver bubbles toward the surface. The plate fell away. The camera drifted in. At first, the compartment looked empty. Just darkness and drifting silt. Then the lights caught something at the back. Rows of metal cylinders, stacked neatly, still intact. They weren't crates. They weren't barrels. They were canisters, painted once in military gray, now faded to the color of ash. Symbols were stenciled on their sides. Japanese characters mixed with numbers and English letters. The last two words chilled everyone who saw them. Do not open. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Holt's voice was calm but low. Bring one up. The winch groaned as the canister rose through black water. When it broke the surface, salt sprayed the deck like cold rain. The metal hissed and steamed as it touched the air for the first time in nearly 50 years. The crew gathered around it, but Holt hesitated. Her instinct screamed that something about it was wrong. The markings weren't wartime Japanese at all, they looked newer. Decades newer. That night, as the storm gathered on the horizon, Holt sat alone in the ship's control room, studying photographs of the canister under magnification. What she saw made her blood run cold. The paint pattern beneath the corrosion wasn't Japanese. It matched an American military standard introduced in 1953. The realization hit like a wave. The canisters weren't loaded before the Awa Maru sank, they were placed there afterward. She rushed to the deck, rain hammering the steel, wind howling through the rigging. The crate sat where they'd left it, covered by a tarp that fluttered like a flag. Holt pulled it back and stared. The surface gleamed under lightning. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw something move behind the thin seam of metal. A vibration, soft but steady. And then bang! A sound like a muffled detonation cracked through the storm. The canister split open along one side, spilling not coins or gold, but a flood of dark oily liquid that reeked of chemicals and decay. The deckhands shouted, pulling back, covering their mouths. One of them collapsed seconds later, gasping. The liquid hissed where it touched the deck, eating through paint and metal alike. They dumped it overboard, watching it vanish into the waves. But the smell stayed, so did the silence. Holt didn't sleep that night. She combed through archives, comparing photos of the canister's code to old naval documents. One file stood out: declassified fragments of a 1954 operation known as Deep Current. The file described an underwater deposit near Taiwan, sealed by US and Japanese engineers, containing materials of strategic containment value. Whatever was inside, it wasn't treasure. It was something meant never to return to the surface. By morning, the Endeavour's captain made the call to end the expedition. The coordinates were marked classified. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, but Holt couldn't forget. Weeks later, back on land, she traced the Deep Current project to a joint post-war alliance, the same one that helped rebuild Japan's Navy under American oversight. Among the listed cargo reports were codenames: Siren, Lantern, each tied to recovered sensitive materials, each ending with the same instruction: do not salvage Rec 74A, Rec 74A. The AWA MARU, it wasn't carrying looted gold. It had become a vault for something far darker: war's leftovers, chemicals, documents, maybe even experiments no one was meant to see again. Somewhere between guilt and pragmatism, both nations had decided to bury their shared secrets under the sea. But there was one last question that clawed at Holt's mind. If the AWA Maru had been repurposed after the war, who put those canisters there, and why pretend they'd always been part of the wreck? A message arrived days later from an anonymous sender. It contained a single photograph, a sonar image dated only a year earlier. It showed a massive structure under the AWA Maru's bow, half buried in sand, pulsing faintly with heat. Along the bottom edge of the image, faint but legible, was a string of letters: US and monitor-linked signal active. A US Navy monitoring beacon, still transmitting. That meant one thing: someone was still watching the wreck. Holt booked another ship within a month. This time, under a false company name. No permits. No observers. She would go back alone if she had to. Some truths, once uncovered, don't let you rest. The night before departure, she sat on the pier watching the water shimmer beneath the moonlight. It looked innocent, a Genkum, endless, inviting. But she knew better now. The sea didn't hide its secrets to protect them. It hid them to protect us. When dawn came, the boat pulled away from shore. The coordinates were locked. The ocean was waiting. Somewhere beneath that glassy surface, the AWA Maru still held her silence. And if Holt was right, the treasure everyone had been hunting for wasn't gold at all. It was something far more dangerous, something alive. The depth the ocean keeps the sea was motionless, a sheet of liquid glass stretching into infinity. Beneath that silence, somewhere in the black corridors of the AW, the truth waited like a heartbeat too slow to hear. Dr. Maren Holt stood at the edge of her vessel, idle, watching the horizon dissolve into fog. It had been weeks since the disaster aboard the Endeavour. Weeks of questions that no one wanted answered. Yet here she was again, above the same cursed coordinates, drawn back by something stronger than reason, an unfinished story. This time, she wasn't alone. 3 crew members had joined her, all veterans of deep-sea salvage, men who didn't scare easily. They called her mad in private, but greed has its own gravity. Holt told them there was treasure involved, precious metals sealed in post-war vaults. That was half a lie. She'd stopped believing in gold long ago. What she wanted was proof. Proof that what sank with the AWA Maru wasn't loot or legend, but evidence of something darker. Something that still pulsed with life under the silt. The submersible Orion lowered into the depths at dawn, its lights sliced through the blue like twin spears, fading into green, then grey, then black. The radio cracked every few minutes with Holt's voice, steady and calm, even as static whispered around the words. Depth, 800 meters. 1,000. Temperature dropping. Visibility decreasing. Then came the first anomaly. The sonar feed glitched. Shapes moved where no shapes should move. At first, the operator thought it was just debris stirred by the current. Then, the readings stabilized and the outline on the screen didn't fade. It was massive, circular, almost architectural. Structure beneath the wreck, Holt said. Not natural. Her breath quickened as Orion descended further. The AWA Maru emerged slowly from the gloom like a sleeping animal, ribs bent, bow cracked open. But below it, barely visible beneath layers of sediment, stood something impossible, a perfect ring of metal, fused to the seabed, pulsing faintly with light. Are you getting this? She whispered. The crew stared in silence. The light on the ring flickered, almost like Morse code. It wasn't reflection. It was rhythm. Holt directed the sub closer. As the cameras neared the structure, the silt parted like smoke. Symbols were etched into the metal Japanese characters, mixed with numbers and English letters. It was the same hybrid language she'd seen on the canisters. The markings spelled one phrase, containment perimeter. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. Suddenly, the lights on the ring surged. The water vibrated. A low hum rolled through the ocean, deep enough to be felt in the bones. The sub's instruments flickered. Then, one by one, systems began to fail. Power dropped 50%. 30%, we're losing guidance. The pilot tried to pull back, but the currents changed directions, sucking the sub toward the wreck. Something invisible was pulling them in. The camera feed blurred, the sea around them spinning with streaks of light. Like reflections of distant lanterns moving in a current they couldn't see. Holt's voice steadied, though her hands were shaking. Hold course. We need one close scan of the hull. The sub scraped along the metal flank of the AWA Maru. Dust erupted. For a moment, there was only chaos. Then, as the water cleared, a shape appeared on the monitor-sealed hatch. Identical to the one she'd seen on the earlier dive. But this time, it was slightly open. The crew stared. Doctor, that hatch wasn't open before. I know, she whispered. The pilot maneuvered the sub forward. Inside the hatch was a narrow passage filled with debris paper, rust, the ghostly remains of equipment. But deeper inside, the lights caught something strange. Rows of objects stacked along the wall. Not canisters, not crates. Cylinders of glass long human length, covered in algae and corrosion. Inside one of them was movement. A shape floated behind the frost, vague and distorted. Limbs? Cloth? It was impossible to tell. Holt's heart pounded. The glass shimmered as if reacting to the sub's lights. Then, for a single breath, something inside pressed against the surface from within. The pilot swore. We're leaving now. Wait, Holt cried. Zoom in. The camera obeyed. The image sharpened. It wasn't a body. It was a suit. A diver's suit, American design, 1950 segundos, era. And on the chest plate, stenciled in fading white paint, was a name, Hollister. The sub's lights flickered again, and the glass cracked with a sharp, metallic scream. They pulled back fast. The hatch slammed shut behind them, as if slammed by an unseen force. Pressure alarms The currents roared. Something was rising beneath the ship. From the control room on the Eidolon, the surface crew watched the sonar bloom with movement. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the wreck, spreading for miles. Then, the feed went dead. Minutes later, the sub broke the surface, coughing out steam. Holt and the pilot stumbled out, drenched in sweat and salt water. Their eyes were wide, unfocused. The sub's exterior was scorched, like it had brushed against fire. That night, as storm clouds gathered again, Holt played the last few seconds of recovered footage. The screen showed the open hatch, the diver's suit, and a faint reflection, someone standing behind the glass. Not a corpse. A man, eyes open, watching. She froze the frame. Enlarged it. The face was clear now. The same features from an old Navy file she'd seen years before. Commander James Hollister, the man lost during Project Neptune. The man who should have been dead for 40 years. Except his eyes. They were still moving. The ship's generator died at midnight. The ocean went dark again. Holt sat in the flickering light of a lantern, her hands trembling as the Eidolon rocked on the waves. She could hear faint sounds through the hull. 3 knocks, then 2, then 1. The same pattern every diver had reported since the beginning. She whispered into the dark, "What did they make you?" No answer came, only the endless hum of the sea. But deep below, the containment ring glowed once more, brighter now, pulsing like a heartbeat. Whatever the Americans and Japanese had buried after the war wasn't resting anymore. It was waking. As lightning split the sky, Holt realized something that turned her fear to dread. The containment wasn't built to keep people out, it was built to keep something in, and now, it was failing.